Okay, so this week we're moving on. Just a recap there of what we did last week. We were getting you into going with HTML, getting some basic principles of how the web works, and getting you used to the tools that we're going to be using for the first few weeks. Today now we're making some progress into CSS. Last week, you might recall, we toured the module in detail, got some basic concepts around the nature of the web, and we've all seen now at this point some HTML in action, browser loading HTML, and even a little bit of CSS, although we didn't really explain that very well so far. Today's class then, as I was saying, is looking at CSS in a bit more detail. We'll be looking at CSS this week and next week, a little bit the week after. It's kind of a whistle-stop tour really of CSS. It's not a comprehensive overview of the language. It's the basics we need to make some progress. The title of our module, as you might recall, is Web Development, not Web Design or Web User Experience or Interaction Design. The word development there is quite intentional, and we're looking at moving into the realm of building web applications as opposed to websites or web experiences. Now, that doesn't mean CSS isn't a critically important skill in the field, and that's a discipline in its own right. But we need certainly to have the basics, and that's what we're doing the next few weeks. But we'll be moving beyond the user experience and user interface elements to looking at web applications in about 4 to 5 weeks from now. So a bit of work to do to get there yet. However, before we even do all that, just going to review some aspects of web development HTML from last week. So we'll take a little bit of a tour through these basics, some more terminology on the web HTML standard itself, and might do another poll or two, and then we'll spend the rest of the session today focusing on the CSS language. So let's go back to it for a second, to HTML. We mentioned briefly last week that we might categorize HTML into these groups. In fact, I presented a number of different categories. It was a little bit random. But if we take this one here as a starting point: structural, head, text, list, image, table, form, frame, deprecated, and proprietary and non-standard elements. This notion of deprecated elements is it's kind of a feature of the web in general, and also technology, particularly programming. Our languages and our notations are maturing all the time, and some of the older ones have accumulated cruft, which we start to retire from use, or has been retired in certain circumstances. This is true of Java, and it's very much true of HTML and some aspects of CSS. Finding out which are deprecated and which are not, well, we can read about it. We can also see shifting fashions occasionally. And also, as the standards evolve, we see new elements doing a better job that old elements took on. And that's part of our skills acquisition to be able to spot these. You'll also notice we've got some proprietary and non-standard. Well, these were a big problem in the early days of the web. Less of a problem these days now, because the standards movement, as controlled by a combination of W3C and the browser vendors, is much more robust. There was a time when particularly Microsoft were particularly active in non-standard elements, but these have largely started to fade away now at this point. So we'll just look at these 5 though. The other 5 or 6 we'll hardly look at. Obviously, we need to look at forms when we get onto web apps later on. Tables, I think I'm going to let you explore and discover tables on your own. And the last 3 are linked to us in this course itself. So our topic list are our subset that's very tight, really. Let's start then with these structural elements. You saw these in action last week. These are elements in the outer container. So we've got HTML itself is the element that contains our entire page. Head and body are also structural elements that are giving us that outline structure. The head element, it sounds like heading, but it's not really. It's providing metadata for the browser. There's a page title going in there, but that page title may not necessarily appear anywhere on your page. In fact, it'll appear on the browser window. Other information going into the head we'll be seeing in due course, including CSS information, and also external files and other external files. The body element, that's where everything you build on the page exists. We have one body element only. That one body element contains your entire content. And you've seen that in action last week. We had some headers and paragraphs and maybe a few elements inserted in there. It's a single element, remember, not multiple elements. Each page just has one of these. We also think of the headers 1 to 6 as being structural. They give us what you can see there rendered as obvious headings in various sizes. There's 1 to 6 defined. The browser probably gives you different sizes for 1 to 3, and then 4 to 6, most browsers tend to show the same size. Why would we bother having this? Well, it's not the browser's job to show you the header, to control the header font or bold or size. That's part of our styling, and the default fonts are just there to give us some guidance as we're designing a page independent of styling, which we have been doing a little bit so far. Block quotes, another structural element, provides us with a mechanism for indenting, usually paragraphs. It's intended to render or describe an extract from possibly another site, or in the context of an article, a quote from a specific third party. You can see it's indented here in the rendering. It may contain paragraphs, or if it doesn't, then it'll be a single paragraph will be assumed. Break, another structural element, inserts a line break. We had a bit of fun with that last week in looking at different variants of it. We noticed that it's the first element you may have seen that doesn't seem to have a closing tag, which was something we indicated was important. So the break element just exists in isolation here without any closing or forward slash. And P, or paragraph. This is the stock and trade of our basic content. Notice how we're laying out the paragraphs here. It's a particular style we're adopting in that we are choosing to specify the paragraph starting on its own line, concluding on its own line, the tag itself. And then we're choosing to make the paragraph entirely indented and separate from the opening and closing tags. The browser doesn't really care or use any of that information in terms of how it's rendering the paragraph. It's going to render the paragraph by default on a separate line with a line break before and after. But we're deliberately adopting this style so that we can read the HTML a little bit cleaner ourselves. That's called indentation. It's also called best practice or coding standards. And we'll have something to say about coding standards in a few weeks. Now, the next category, just to tour it briefly, there's a set of elements that appear inside the head element. So they're called head elements. Title being the only one we've seen so far. There are a few others as well. As I mentioned, that title, it's not to be confused with a header. It isn't really. It's a title for the document, the page that the user has just visited. And usually that title will be displayed inside the browser toolbar, header bar, perhaps in a tab slot. You've probably seen that in action already. Another head element we saw very briefly in the lab last week was a style element. And of course, this was our first view of CSS, the topic of today's class. So inside the header, we can open a style tag. The style tag appears to have a type attribute. You can see that here. And then the body of the style tag, well, it's a little bit confusing. We seem to be using the keyword body here for some reason. We'll be explaining that today. And then inside this particular body, we have braces and something that looks quite different from the HTML we've been encountering to date. So this is the language we're addressing. And you can see from the nomenclature there that it's addressing visual elements, fonts, margins, colors, and so on. It's not providing any new content for the page. It's providing perhaps one of many different stylistic elements for a given page. Text formatting elements, we've seen those in action as well. In particular, the A tag, which is hypertext or link. And you've been experimenting a little bit with these in the first lab, hopefully. We can see that we define an anchor tag to contain a path to another HTML file, and then a text element or a text sentence or a few words which contains the text to be used in the link itself. So this is the link that powers the internet. This is the magic element that takes us from page to page around the globe. You'll notice the link I have put in here doesn't really reference our website. That is, it's only referencing what seems to be a folder, possibly in a file on my own computer, this link here. But of course we can put in standard HTTP URLs here. That is, we can put a standard web address and the link will take us away from the page we're currently looking at and onto others. We also have an alternative. You can see here a link within a page. This is a little bit different from the example above. Here we're laying down a H2 element with what looks like an attribute we haven't even discussed yet, an attribute called ID. And then anywhere else in the page, perhaps at multiple locations on the page, we're laying down what looks like a reference to that ID. That's an internal link, and it's effectively going to allow us to switch around, scroll up or down to a different part of the same page. Some more text formatting elements. EM for emphasis is one of the first we looked at last week. Seems to turn on italics. So we're able to adjust something of the typeface using HTML. And Q for quote. Here, this will insert inline a double quote. Difficult to see it here, but you can see we have a Q here and a Q here. And that turns into these double quotes here. Okay, so why are we doing this? Why not just put in a double quote? Well, quotes are considered to be locale specific, and the inventors of HTML wanted a standard that would work beyond just US English, or EU English at that time. Quotation mark, if you're running perhaps in Spanish, will look quite different. I think also slightly different in German. By using the quote mark, we're getting some first attempt at independence across locales. It's one of a number of elements in this category, and we'll be looking at some approaches to that as well later on. Now the list elements, if we want a bulleted list, it's one of the most widely used elements in HTML. You can see it in action here. Unordered list is what we've got. So we encapsulate the entire list of bullets in a UL element opening and closing. And then li, standing for list item, is where we assemble the individual elements. Now this UL is widely used not just for lists. It's used for navigation elements as well, and we'll be using it for navigation, as we'll see a little bit later on. So it's a general purpose way of assembling lists that may or may not be rendered as bulleted lists, as I'm showing here. Ordered list is the first variant of that. It's the same thing again, except numbers generated. These numbers are automatically generated, and some attempt will be made to indent these and keep them aligned. Now these ones, you might have had fun with these, particularly getting these to work correctly last week. Planting an image on a page. Looks a little bit like the anchor tag, the HTTP link element, but it's quite different, in fact, in focus. It's going to land from wherever source we identify an image. Again, in our early experiments, these images we're storing locally, and we're pulling them into our page at the specific point at which the image tag appears. That image tag could come from another website. And in fact, we could put into source a link to an external media server, or even just a website that has an image stored or available to it and accessible. You'll also notice an alt tag here. This is not visible currently on our page, but this would be made, the text would be made visible if the image was unavailable, or perhaps if the image was taking time to download. Less of an issue on our desktop machines, but perhaps quite an issue on mobile, possibly. And you would have seen mobile loading a good bit slower. A few more small elements just to tidy up. The span element. This is also quite widely used. It's interesting because it doesn't really do anything. And if you're including a span element, it doesn't have any visual appearance. So it's by default, we might call it a no-op in computing terms. Here I'm putting a span element, and I have a sentence or a few words inside the span. Now the purpose of this is to be used in conjunction most likely with CSS, and we may be able to use span elements to target some styling at specific sub-ranges within paragraphs, for instance. And it's an important element in that context to be used in conjunction with CSS. One last word on this before we move on. We mentioned attributes last week, and you've seen attributes in action already in our few examples and in the labs. Attribute, remember, is the name for a component inside an element. This is an attribute here, the attribute href, which is relevant to the A tag. And these are two attributes here, source and alt, which are relevant to the image tag. And you can see what they mean, really. The source or href refer to the resources we're trying to access, and the alt is specifically for image. There are other attributes, though, that are common to all elements. And we'll be looking at two of these in detail today. In particular, any element, we can associate a style with it. That is, we can attach the style attribute and give it a value, and that value will become quite significant in the style work you'll be doing in today's lab. Similarly, ID. Both of these are kind of close relations, really. Class and ID. And there's hardly any page you will ever construct which won't have one or both of these liberally sprinkled throughout the page itself. So it's important that we get a handle on those concepts today, because we'll be using them immediately. The other ones are less interest for us, really. Some style issues can be associated with an element, but we'll tend to not use style at all, in fact. We'll keep style in our CSS. Language and title are two other ones that are used occasionally by tools, possibly by internationalization or localization, but we won't be using them at all, in fact. In fact, the only tool we'll be using will be class and ID of those particular elements. Okay, just looking back at our poll, just asked you to give me an idea of what browsers you're using. I noticed that Chrome #1, Internet Explorer and Firefox kind of second. Opera quite high. That's interesting. So Opera edging out Firefox and Chrome, and no Safari is there. Looking at the platforms you're using, mobile followed by tablet, followed by laptop, followed by tablet, and then mobile followed by tablet, followed by laptop are the two key ones, with second place laptop, mobile, tablet. Interesting. So mobile looks like the majority if we look at those stats. So most people go to use the web largely on the mobile. Of course, that's changed a lot now in the last few years, and these figures would have been quite different if we took a poll 5 years ago. Similarly, Chrome, I guess we use Chrome because it tends to be fast and reliable. It also, I guess, has a range of features and services built into it that we may come to rely upon. Firefox has gone through some major changes in the last few months, and they claim to be approaching Chrome in speed, so perhaps not worth ruling out completely. Notice that nobody has put Edge in, which is interesting. Edge being the more modern browser on the Windows environment. Okay, that's our start. I'm just going to take a little break here, and I'm going to open up a few other polls here just for the few minutes we'll take the break, and then we'll come back and kick into our CSS proper. So you might just hang around for a second, fill out the poll, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay, let's keep going then. Just looking down at the polls there, I can see them here below me. First one along the line there, which element can be categorized as a head element? Title. Yeah, title is the one. These categories are kind of useful, I think, for learning. They're not something you need to memorize or know off by heart in any sense. But if you're tackling a new element, you just might want to put it into one of these boxes initially, just to get your learning up and running. Second one is a bit of a trick question, really. Which one sticks in a blank line? I guess all of the above. So we mentioned this very briefly last week. Should an element open? Should it close? Does it have to be closed? Can it be closed implicitly? Well, you can do any of these things with the elements, obviously. Some elements need to be opened and closed if it'll work effectively. Other elements, a small number that are considered atomic, you just land them in and we assume there's no closing aspect to them. So all of the above might be the answer there. How do you create a link on a page? href, a link, ref, URL. Well, I put this question in because the names of the tags can be a little bit arbitrary. And if one were starting again, they might have picked a slightly more rational or ordered set of tags, but we're stuck with the tag names we have now. So putting in a link is the a tag. href is part of a. It's also part of some other tags, and there are also other ways of putting in links, particularly in images, which don't use href. You've seen source in action. But the a tag is the answer in that instance. I'll just open one last one here, but I won't give you time to click on it just yet because we'll move on. We might discuss this one in the next break. Right. CSS. What's the point and what does it look like? We'd like to be able to build pages like this. That is, pages now become rich in content, color, engaging displays, perhaps close to the problem they're trying to solve, that is the business they're promoting, or the user experience they're trying to convey. We're just building pages using HTML only. It may be possible to ultimately build pages like what you're seeing here, but it would be very challenging and very difficult to get right. So CSS is to meet this challenge, really. It arrived not long after HTML itself was defined, but HTML originally didn't have the notion of CSS, so it's a subsequent addition to the family of standards. Its purpose is to tackle this style issue. And in fact, it's not just style involved in this business of displaying pages. It's also structure and function are three other concerns. And we can start to see how these three concerns, we know they overlap, but we also are keen on keeping them reasonably separate. Separate in perhaps the conception of how these concerns are assembled, but also in the implementation. Let's just talk a little bit about those before we move on. Content or structure is where we would be living in the world of HTML. This would be the core content of our website. And it may not just be text, it may also be sound and video, perhaps animations. This is the core information that the site embodies, and we like to consider it or contemplate it independently of how it's presented. Presentation is how it's styled, colors, fonts, layouts. It may be that we want more than one style. So maybe the same content can be rendered in different ways depending on the audience. So pulling it apart, pulling the way we define the presentation apart, has some significant advantages over enmeshing them together. Thirdly, there's behavior. And here we're looking at user interaction, perhaps the responsiveness of the page to events or to selection or mouse or touch. And it's third great category, which is beyond the scope of our course for the moment. Point about these, though, is that the way the web is evolved is these are increasingly separated as far as possible. And that betrays a principle in computer science called separation of concerns, which is applicable not just to web, of course. It's the key building block of most software design. That is, keep aspects of presentation, structure, and behavior separate languages, separate concerns completely, separate files in our case, such that each can be evolved independently, possibly by independent experts. It may be that the same skill set is not relevant for all three, or that we have specialists involved in each one of those three at separate stages. So that's the core point of CSS, moving our CSS, our design decisions out of HTML, storing them separately in separate files with a whole different notation and nomenclature and best practice applied. It's reasonably intuitive, and we saw a glimpse of it in last week's lab without explaining anything. On the left, we have a HTML document. You can see the head and body here. You can see some of the head elements we were mentioning. Title is the only one we discussed so far, but there's a new one here called link, and also a meta one, which seems to be referring to something to do with character sets. And then the body is just the header and text. So on the left, we have classic markup. On the right, we're looking at a style sheet. It seems to be referring to elements from the document itself. So we do seem to have some sort of link here to our recurrence of H1, and also we see P relevant. So there is some linkage. But the document, if we call it that, or style sheet on the right here, is not HTML. It's a different language. We're using braces, which might remind you of Java processing from your work with column, and things that might vaguely remind you of variables, but they're not really. And we'll get into what they actually mean shortly. This example we just looked at renders like this. And what we have here, in fact, is what we call two rules. And those rules dictate how the H1 and the paragraph are displayed. First one, it's easy enough to read, really. It's designed to be human readable. So color, background, and something like a border seems to be referred to. And that's giving us this image, or this rendering in the browser. So that's how it looks. And you will note that the HTML document contains none of this. There's no hint in the HTML document as to what colors or borders or any aspect of the visual display. We do notice, though, this here, which seems to indicate that we have a binding going on here between the element and elements in our page and an external file. That external file is our style sheet, and our style sheet is named here. Notice we're using the href attribute. How does this work? Well, browsers are among the most sophisticated applications going these days. There's a million or more lines of code in these engines. They're parsing HTML. They're loading external CSS. They're parsing CSS. That means making sense of it. And they're also creating what we call a DOM tree. DOM standing for Document Object Model. And this document object model is very important. And it's something you become very familiar with later on when you get into more detailed web development experiences. The HTML becomes a tree. The parsing of the CSS effectively decorates that tree, and that decorated tree is displayed in the browser. How fast the browsers do this, how reliable they do it, how they cope with malformed or erroneous CSS, how they conform to the latest standards, well, that's all stock and trade of the browser vendors. That's why they're bringing out releases weekly or monthly to keep up with moving standards, fix bugs in their own code, and evolve more rapid rendering engines. This is the link element we just mentioned. It's a head element, as we've discussed. It seems to indicate using href, the name of a file that we're going to load. That's where our style sheet is going to live. And we also note there are some other elements here that are, for the moment, we just accept these exactly as they are. Sometimes we call these incantations, and you'll see some recommendations would indicate that we should drop these or drop some of them. And we look at some of those more modern practices later on. For the moment, they indicate that to the browser, it is a CSS style sheet we're loading. There are possibly other types of file that can be loaded, but style sheet is the primary one this element is used for. Here's the advantage then of separating out our presentation issues from our structural content. One style sheet can serve multiple pages. If each page had embedded within it some way of describing the presentation element, then we would have inflated the page unnecessarily. Style, externally held, allows us to have a consistent, perhaps look and feel, perhaps a shared set of styles across multiple sites, and some key centralized area to adjust styles or improve them as time goes on. All that is made possible by having a shared style sheet, in this case, accessible from each of the pages we're building. And you'll be seeing that in action in this week's lab. Now, some terminology. We've talked about head elements, we've talked about elements themselves, attributes, opening and closing tags. That's the language of HTML. There's a different set of terms we use when discussing CSS. And it's useful for us just to look at these now very explicitly for a few moments. First of all, rules. The entire clause, we might call it, inside a CSS file is a rule. It indicates a collection of attributes we're trying to apply to some set of elements. In this case, we're trying to style P, or paragraphs, red with a background color. So at its highest level, CSS file is a set of rules. Now we can break those rules down into two components, the selector and the declaration. The selector, as the name indicates, identifies which part of the document this rule is to apply to. The selector here looks quite simple, just P. P doesn't mean one paragraph, it means all paragraphs on the page that this style sheet is bound to. The selector is probably one of the more complicated parts of the standard. It looks fairly simple here now, but how could it get complicated? Well, we'll see perhaps next week where the selectors get a little bit more interesting than just single element names. Moving into the declaration, we talk about property and value. Property value pairs. Property first, colon, separates it out, value second, semicolon third. The position of these colons, semicolons is important, and we should be, as much as possible, ensuring our CSS conforms to this exact structure. Dropping a semicolon, dropping a colon may continue to behave as if it's kind of working. But depending on the surrounding context, it could cause pretty serious malfunctions in the style sheet. So we need to be quite careful about this. Now, you will have noticed in programming that when you miss a semicolon, well, you're told about it pretty quickly. Your browser or your processing environment isn't shy about complaining. We don't really have that by default in CSS. So you are on your own for the moment. Now we'll be able to improve on that later on, but for the moment you're on your own in terms of ensuring you're adhering to these standards correctly. Another example then, let's annotate a little bit more detail. Background color red, and just some additional rules of thumb there, just to get yourself oriented. So that's the basic structure. It's rules, and the rules consist of selectors and declarations. If we just get used to those terms, selector is that part of the rule that allows us to target some of the elements on a page. The declaration collects together the presentational properties we want associated with that selection. And the declaration consists effectively of a list of properties and values. For the moment, CSS doesn't really contain logic. So even though this might vaguely remind you of processing or Java, there's no real room at the moment for an if statement in here, for instance, or for a variable, or for iteration. I know you've just been doing it, even though you might be interested or tempted to see what iteration would mean in this context. It's not relevant really to CSS. CSS is a declarative language. We're declaring something and we want the browser to make it happen. We're not really writing a program here. Now, it's not quite true 100% what I'm saying here, because there are a variety of CSS derived languages which bring it closer to programming as we understand it. It's an interesting field in its own right. It's beyond our scope, though, certainly for this module to look into that realm. Okay, back to our little poll there for a second. We were looking at the client server aspect. I'm looking at the question here on the right, just down there. Server issues a request and waits for the client to respond. Is that true or false? The client issues a request and waits for a server to respond. Client issues response when server issues request. Client server issue request to each other. I think most people are going for the second one. Client issues a request and waits for the server to respond. Seems kind of a weird question to be asking, but it is a fundamental part of how the web works, and particularly how browsers behave. It's also, you may feel it slightly counterintuitive, because whenever you're using the web, stuff is happening without you requesting anything, and that's true as well. That's true because the browsers implement a variety of techniques that go beyond the basic model the web was invented for, and the model we're learning in this module. So the browser's interaction with the server is becoming much more interesting than it has in the past, and it's going beyond this client requests and waiting for server response model. However, we won't be considering those yet, at least not this course. And we will simplify everything by assuming the second one here is always how it works. Client makes a request, browser responds. Okay, I'll take any questions now for a few minutes. We'll take a short break, maybe just 3 or 4 minutes. And then we will resume with a more detailed look into CSS itself. So I'm just going to set this to maybe 4 minutes. Start it, and I'll see you in a few seconds. I'll take any questions if anybody has any in the Slack chat room. Okay, guys, I think you're starting to get interested now in some things you'd like to do with this almost immediately, and we might as well get on and explore it. So we've looked so far at just a review of the HTML standard itself, particularly some of the categories of elements, just to get us back in the mood. And we've looked at the basics now of CSS here for a little while. And you can see the basics are different language. We see its purpose, and we can start to see how it can start to be used to influence the simple layout or simple structure, colors, fonts, etc. of a page. So let's start looking at that in a little bit more detail and see if we can make some more progress. These rules then. In particular, Niall's question in the Slack channel there, we had a rule P which seemed to apply to all paragraphs. But what if I didn't want all paragraphs to have the same or a specific style? Well, we go beyond that. That's where we look at the use of more sophisticated selectors, as we'll see here. First of all, just some other inferences from our look at these rules so far. Here's a simple name value or property value pair, border bottom, colon. Then you can see I'm specifying a sequence of values here, a pixel, something like a pattern, and then a color. So the property has 3 values, and I'm specifying them in that order. That order is significant and will be part of the tools you'll be picking up as you get to understand CSS a little bit more. It's designed to be reasonably intuitive. Here's another example, H1, H2, and a P. So all H1s get gray sans serif, all H2s get gray sans serif, all paragraphs get maroon. You can see where we're heading with this here. H1 and H2, we are choosing for the moment to have them exactly the same. So we can combine them. In this variant, then, we are including both selectors, both elements are on one line with a comma separating them. This means that all H1s and all H2s will get that specific style. The comma, a bit curiously, is quite significant, and it's quite important that this comma is present. If we leave it out, we might get some weird behavior that we didn't intend. You could read the comma as and. You haven't done logic in processing or Java yet, but the and, or, not logical operators in CSS, this is kind of close to the end, or how we understand end. So that's just making that a little bit clearer, but here's a slight variation on it, adding a new property. So now everybody in the H1 and H2 gets that font color and a border. Paragraphs are kept separate. And here we've now pulled them apart again. And we are applying H1 and H2 with our color and our font. And H1 makes a reappearance with an additional element not applicable to H2. So we can see some element of sharing going on here. So it's becoming a little bit programmery almost already. Multiple ways of doing things, possible duplication we might strive to reduce, but then the duplication might involve us exploring modest ways of doing variations. All that is kind of programmer speak, really. Just to re-emphasize that, here is a set of rules for paragraph. All of these will be applied to all paragraphs, or we group them into one rule for brevity. So the bottom, the description here is just a little bit easier to read and easier to understand. Here is something slightly different. H1, H2, H3, H4 all have color maroon defined. So we take the property out into a single declaration, and we use the comma selector, or the, I might call it the end, to ensure that H1 to H6 all get this color. If you can make the step into contemplating the page as a tree, then it makes more sense, or can begin to put the pieces together. Remember, all elements have parent elements except HTML. Most elements have opening and closing tags, so they have descended elements if they do. And because of those simple constraints, the document is a tree structure. Technically, I think the term is an acyclic graph. You can get into the detail on that. But it's a simple tree structure with a single root, and it's always descending. Our selectors then are sort of sampling or reaching into this tree and allowing us to, in a single statement if necessary, affect a broad subset of nodes in the tree itself. So it's a useful way to perhaps consider how the page is structured. It's not just conceptual, it exists. The tree we're looking at here is called the DOM, the Document Object Model. And when you look at implementing behavior later on via JavaScript, this DOM is available to you as a programmer, and you can perform surgery on that tree. You can change or remove or extend the tree dynamically. That has a startling effect, because once you change the DOM, the visual display changes immediately. And we'll see a little bit of that in a few weeks' time. Here's H1 and H2. We see we're selecting both H1 and H2 elements in that instance. And here is P, and P is selecting 3 elements in that instance. All 3 are going to get that particular font style. These font styles, that's fonts, as you might know, is again, science in its own right. Sans serif is a term we use for fonts that don't have the kind of curled up edges. You can see that there's a sans serif font on this page. This is one here. The L's in this instance don't have any edges on the top or the bottom. But if you look closely at the L over here, you can see it does have little curricules. So we're saying we want a sans serif font here for all the paragraphs. Sans serif is not a font, it's a font family. And I think in the lab this week you'll be exploring a little bit of how font families work. Now back to Niall's question. The class attribute we mentioned in the first part of our talk today. It's a universal or global attribute. It can be applied to any element. So it's an attribute that's highly versatile. And I mentioned that there'll hardly be any pages you'll ever write without using classes. Here's the class in action to specifically target styles at paragraphs. We have 3 class statements defining two different class identifiers. And you can pick them out there, I think, yourselves fairly clearly. We've got this one here, this one, that one, and this one. We can apply class anywhere, and we're just choosing to arbitrarily land them directly into those parts of the page. What does that mean? Well, that means our rules can take on a different structure, and you can see the examples over here on the right. We have the rule we're familiar with from our earlier examples. This is a very simple paragraph. Give everything white foreground, white background, black foreground. That's fine. But look at these 2 rules here. They're quite different in structure. And these are using dot syntax. And whenever you see dot, we know we're talking about classes. And when we say dot with style, we're specifically naming a class, and we're saying apply this rule to all classes with a name with style. Notice also we're not using double quotes here in the CSS, although it's used, of course, in the HTML, because all attributes must be included in double quotes. Similarly, we're using .warn here. Again, you can see the idea with a slightly different color. So this allows us to target specific paragraphs that have been marked with class. We can target all paragraphs without any class specification, and now we can target specifically all the elements that have the with style or warn categories. So classes or categories are central really to how we would build more interesting style sheets. Classes and IDs go hand in hand, and ID is also a global attribute, an attribute we can associate with any element. Remember, the attribute is something we can insert right into the element's opening tag, as we've seen it in action just here. Here is the same page with an ID included. And we have a new ID, we've just called it arbitrarily first here. I should note that these names, first, with style, warn, are made up. That's not a language, that's not part of any standard, that's not part of somebody's decision for global styles. We just made it up. In fact, that's the case for all your styles. You'll make them up, and you'll pick names that make sense in the context of your document and maybe the styles you're building. ID and class, they look kind of similar. However, we have a different notation, and that notation is the hash symbol. And you can see it here. Here we're saying that we want this one to be green and red, and that explicitly is bound to this one here. Seems to behave similar enough to class if you're looking at it superficially, but there's one important distinction. IDs must be unique, so there can only be one first element on this page. If there is more than one first element, then the page may be considered invalid. This is up to you to enforce. Browsers aren't going to try to figure that out, and the browser may behave differently depending on what mistake you might have made. But in the context of our style sheet, hash means there is one and only one element with this tag, this name first, and I'm targeting this rule at that element. And we never want to break that rule. We never want to bend it or see what happens if we don't formally obey it. Now, there may be no element called first, that's fine, but there must only be one. Now, that's not the case, obviously, in this example with the classes. We do have, with style and warn, we have several warn elements. You can see them in action here. Okay, one final big piece of HTML and how HTML and CSS work together, and then, then we're up and running really on the major concepts we need. This is the div element, div, div standing for division. It's kind of a cousin of the span element we mentioned earlier, except div is a block element, span being the inline equivalent. And divs mean I just have ways of organizing or structuring a page into different regions. Usually those regions may be the subject of specific stylistic decisions, but they may not. There may be functional reasons for it. Nevertheless, whatever motivation we have, divs are central to how pages are constructed. And we usually have multiple divs within a page, or multiple elements that are kind of div-like. We'll be exploring those in a week or two, and fulfill the same role. So we'll understand that div is important, and there are a set of companions to div, which we'll be looking at shortly. Okay, let's see div in action. So here is a document with a couple of classes, one ID, two, and two divisions. You can see those there. Divs contain a number of paragraphs in this instance. We're calling that division main content, and the second division is called footer. So you can see that names here seem to indicate something structurally about the page we're designing. Main content might be the main body of our page through which most of our information is communicated, perhaps. Footer, well, you can see what that might mean, bottom of the page itself. Using divs like this means we can now write rules that target not just individual elements like paragraphs, but target entire divisions. And we'll be starting to do that almost immediately. Now, I haven't explained what borders are yet, or what the styles are, or even anything about colors. Nothing yet, but let's just take it on faith for the moment. But look at the rules that we're writing. In particular, look at the IDs in action, particularly the last two rules here. These rules, main content and footer, are targeting not elements, that is primitive elements, they're targeting entire regions of the page. They're targeting divs. And those divisions, in this case, we're selecting some border elements, putting lines around those elements. So that's quite a powerful page construction little language we've built here now. We have our basic set of elements that we can design the body of a page with. We've just looked at paragraph, heading, image, emphasis, block quote. But any and all of those elements can be encapsulated within divs of various kinds, and those divs can be targeted with rules. The rules we're targeting here are simple enough, just putting frames around them. But imagine if we could write a rule that would move or set the dimensions of those divisions. Maybe move one division to the top, another to the side, another to the bottom of the page. You could establish fairly interesting multi-column layouts with just these two simple tools. Or maybe we have a division that's going to be a navigation for the page, and we can write some very sophisticated rules to give or support some sort of navigation metaphor. That's the fundamentals really of CSS, and it's deceptively simple on first contact, but let's just take a look at some examples that maybe aren't so simple. So I'll move on to our last section now, and we're looking at, let's call it Cascade really. It's a worked example that perhaps it's a little bit simple-minded and unlikely to occur that often, but it does exhibit some aspects of CSS that, well, that are a bit problematic. Let's look at this example here. On the left, I've got just the body. I'm not showing the head. 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, in fact, and a block quote. Some of the paragraphs have got no decorations, no classes, and then 2 of the paragraphs have a class defined. But I'm particularly interested in the second, the final paragraph here, and we see that paragraph has what looks like a class that seems to consist of a sentence or 2 words at least. Now, what's going on there, and what does that mean for the styling of this little page? First of all, I have no indication of the style here, so if there's no style sheet provided, it's rendered exactly as shown. So the use of class is entirely dependent on a style sheet being attached, which we're not showing in this instance. However, if this was our style sheet, this is how it would be displayed. P is black, dot green tea, P dot green tea, P dot raspberry, and P dot blueberry. Notice the ways in which dot is appearing in this context. Dot is appearing on its own, which is how we originally introduced the concept of a class. And dot is now also appearing instead of a comma, remember? Because we have had commas appearing in here before. We seem to have the dot appearing between a element and a class name. And that has some fairly interesting implications. So what does it do? Well, that's our rule set. These are how we might start to consider how do these rules match up with the document. And there are maybe 5 or 6 rules. The first one is explicit. Can I find a element in a document that matches exactly what the selector said? It's called an explicit match rule. Inheritance. This relies on the DOM. And we've looked at the DOM just once or twice now so far. Some sort of mental model you might build, a tree of the page, but it's not a mental model, it's a real model, it's a real tree in the browser. And the browser's tree will be climbed to find matching rules. It's called an inheritance match. Default match, couldn't find any rules, so somewhere in the bowels of the browser there might be a default spreadsheet or a style sheet, and we just follow whatever that does. And then 4, most specific match. And you can see in the example we just looked at, this might come into play. There may be more than one rule that matches. How do we know which rule to pick? Well, here's the same little case study again, decorated. Let's look at them one by one. An explicit match for P. So I had a P rule. You can see it's the first one, and that matches exactly part of the document. There's nothing else will match, so it's clear cut. Q also, remember, is an element that could be affected by styles, and in fact it is. It's an inline element. An inheritance match comes into play here. We'll take on the same color as the parent. If the parent was to change, if the color was to be red, then we would expect really like to be red as well. So it in fact is being matched even though it wasn't mentioned in the document, in the style sheet. Block quote is our default match. Clear enough, I think. There isn't really any rule, so we'll just run with what the browser defaults are. Green T, well, here now we've got a very specific match. I've got a p.green_t. I'm going to go with that. The last one then is the problem. Green tea space blueberry. And we didn't really mention this. This is not an error. It is possible for a class to have multiple components to it. These would be multiple separate classes. So classes can't have spaces in them. If a space appears, the next identifier is another class. And we can keep this going as long as we like. There's no effective limit to the number of classes that can be mentioned or associated with a given element. So now I'm saying here green tea and blueberry. And how do we know which one gets matched? Well, that's another rule, ordering match. And the order that is significant here is not the one you might have thought. It's not the order in which the classes themselves appeared. It's not green tea because we always pick the first one, or blueberry because we always pick the second. The order is irrelevant here in classes. So class order is not considered significant, at least by the browser engine itself. The order is the order as listed in the CSS file itself. That is nearest the bottom. The last one is the one that's going to be applied. So that's our final set of rules. Okay, we're unlikely to be writing style sheets like that, but I think you get a hint here of some of the complexities involved. It's not just a matter of finding the element. There's a bit of interpretation to go on, and there's a bit possible, so I would say possible, there is definite ambiguity involved. And this ambiguity is one of the challenges, really, of dealing with CSS and learning the language. These selectors are the more complicated element, and you'll be starting to get to grips with that in the next few weeks. Just like to look at a few other examples, and these examples aren't quite as frivolous as the one we've just looked at. They are typical of the way style sheets are composed, and you might find them a little bit surprising. Let's look at them one by one for a second. The first one is easy enough. It's a simple selector, paragraph, all paragraphs in a document. That's easy. Second one, dot about. Okay, that's also easy enough. And you can see the word we're using here, about, kind of makes sense for a certain website. It's all elements in the about class. That about class could be a div. So it could be a division, and there could be a whole range of elements inside it, and we're able to style them all with one selector and a rule. That's nice. Corporate history, again, something similar, except it's an ID. There is only one corporate history ID on the page. If it's present, it gets the style. About and corporate history kind of overlap possibly. There may be only one about class as well, but maybe more than one. Corporate history, we're saying there's only one, there's not another. We've seen the H1, H2, H3 type thing in the examples already. Again, think of it as and. So we're targeting all the H1, H2, and 3 with the same declaration. Dot privacy, dot copyright. Again, I'll emphasize that when I'm using dot, these class names are made up. They're the language of the designer for the page, but they obviously must appear on the page. In the case of dot, they must be classes. So here we're saying privacy and copyright get a specific rule, or header and footer. This one then, we've seen a little bit of this just in the last example, quite a specific one. We're saying that this one, footnote, we're looking for a paragraph that has the class footnote. There may be multiple footnotes, but they must be paragraphs. We're not targeting all footnotes. We're only targeting paragraphs that are footnotes in this instance. Now, some fun. Hash body copy dot user generated. That looks like a bit of a mouthful. We're saying we're targeting the single element on the page that has the body copy ID. This may be a division. And we're looking inside that for any elements that have the user generated class. So it's like a little calculus almost, if you can envisage it. Next one is also interesting. I want to go to all the elements with the navigation class, and I want any descendant elements that are links. So notice that there's no comma separating here. If there were, it would be different. There's no comma. So we're looking at some quite specific here. And effectively, we're looking at the inheritance tree structure coming into play. Something similar going on in the one after. Go to primary navigation. Inside primary navigation, see if there are any descendants that are list items, and find one that is marked current. In fact, that second one there is of interest to us because we will be trying to deploy something like this pretty soon if we're to get a little navigation structure running. Now, the other ones I'll leave you piece your way through yourselves. They look a little bit obscure, but they're not radically unusual. They're reasonably common. Now, how could this one make any sense? Well, I mentioned list elements, ordered lists and list elements have multiple uses, and it's not just displaying bulleted items, it's displaying complicated navigation structures. And this is reaching into quite deep level into a nested list element structure. Now, that wouldn't be necessarily rendered at all like a bulleted list. It could be in a drop-down navigation bar of some kind, styled accordingly. But there we're able to reach into multiple levels deep in a complicated navigation structure. Now, we won't be building any selectors as complicated as this anytime soon, although we will be seeing something like this pretty soon, all right? So we want to be getting our heads around that. And of course, we're only speaking so far about the selectors largely. We haven't looked at the properties or the actual declarations themselves yet. What things can you change? That'll be the subject of our discussions next week. So today's lab is going to take you on a tour of some of these things. Hopefully you will find time to do it. It's probably an hour's worth of work. I still think the load is light enough. I hope you agree with that. If not, I apologize for miscalculating. But the intention of the first week or two is for you to just to get a taste of some of the basics without any major headaches. Typically, any problems you would have had would have been links being broken or the absolute relative path issue being challenging to get your head around, particularly use of dot and dot dot occasionally. You might see that in action this week. That's what the Slack labs are for, so please don't suffer in silence. We can do screen sharing into those labs. You can upload any web pages you're looking at, and we can pull them down and see if there's any little things that are annoying you. So it's important that you make use of that resource. You know what's available on the timetable. I see it's reasonably active in programming, but web is quiet for the moment. So I'm looking forward to some interaction tomorrow. Okay, thanks for your attention. I'll hang around for a little while. Anybody wants to chat? And I put these recordings up as soon as I can, probably by tea time today. I did put up a recording this morning for Colin. He had recorded a supplementary talk, so that's up now as well. I think he sent you a note on that. Okay, better camera now. I can see you all a little bit clearer than I could last week. Only joking, don't worry, don't get panicky. I can't see anybody. And I will be looking forward to chatting to you again next week. So see you then, and best of luck in the labs, and maybe chat to you tomorrow.